They inherited a frozen shelter nobody wanted for 75 cents. But what this struggling elderly couple found buried beneath the stone floor wasn't just their salvation. It was $245 million worth of secrets that would expose a truth powerful people had hidden for over 30 years. Before we dive into the story, make sure to smash subscribe, because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The wind off the Appalachian Ridge cut through clothes like a razor through paper, and Margaret Hayes felt every bit of it in her bones. She stood at the kitchen window of their small rental house, watching frost creep across the glass like fingers reaching for warmth. Outside, the sky hung low and grey, pregnant with snow that hadn't fallen yet but promised to bury everything when it did. She was 72 years old, and her hands shook slightly as she held her morning coffee, not from the cold, but from something deeper. Fear, maybe. Or just exhaustion from carrying worry for so long it had become part of her skeleton. Behind her, she heard the familiar shuffle of her husband's slippers across the worn linoleum. Thomas Hayes, 74, moved slower these days. His back had given out years ago after 4 decades working construction, and now he walked with a slight hunch that broke Margaret's heart every time she noticed it. He'd been a tall man once, strong, the kind who could frame a house in a day and still have energy to dance with her in the kitchen. Now he could barely make it up the 3 steps to their front porch without stopping to catch his breath. Thomas poured himself coffee from the pot Margaret had made at 5:30 that morning. She always woke early, a habit from raising 4 children on a budget that never stretched far enough. Even now, with the kids grown and scattered across 3 different states, she couldn't shake the anxiety that came with counting pennies and praying they'd multiply. "How much we got left?" Thomas asked quietly. He didn't look at her when he said it. They'd been married for 51 years, and some conversations didn't need eye contact anymore. They both knew what the answer would be. Margaret set her mug down on the counter, the ceramic clinking against the chipped formica. "About 300 in checking. Bills are due next week. Electric's going to be high with this cold snap." Thomas nodded slowly. He'd heard variations of this same sentence for the past 5 years, ever since his back finally gave out completely and he had to stop working. Social Security didn't go far. Margaret's part-time job at the library had been cut to just 10 hours a week. They'd sold Thomas's truck 2 years ago. Then Margaret's good jewelry last Christmas. They were running out of things to sell and running out of time to figure out what came next. "We'll make it work," Thomas said, the same thing he always said. "We always do." But Margaret heard the crack in his voice, the tiny fracture that meant he wasn't sure anymore. And that scared her more than the empty bank account. The town of Pine Ridge, Virginia, wasn't much to look at. Population 947, or 943 depending on who you asked, and whether they were counting the Henderson twins who'd moved to Richmond but still came back every Thanksgiving. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone's business, and if they didn't, they made it up. The main street had a post office, a Dollar General, a gas station that also served as the town's only restaurant, and a hardware store that had been run by the same family since 1958. Thomas and Margaret had lived in Pine Ridge for 32 years, ever since Thomas got steady work with a construction company out of nearby Bristol. They'd raised their children here, buried Thomas's mother here, celebrated anniversaries and birthdays and graduations here. But they'd never quite belonged. Not really. They were outsiders who'd stayed long enough to become familiar, but not long enough to become family. Which is why, when the news came about the inheritance, the whole town had an opinion about it before Thomas and Margaret even knew what they'd inherited. It was a Tuesday morning in late January when the letter arrived. Margaret had just come home from her shift at the library, her fingers still numb from the walk back. The mail had been shoved through the slot in their front door, and she gathered it up with cold hands, expecting the usual bills and grocery store circulars. But there, among the electric company's final notice and a credit card offer neither of them would qualify for, was a thick, cream-colored envelope with a return address from a law firm in Charleston, West Virginia. Crawford, Bennett and Associates, attorneys at law. Margaret's heart jumped. Lawyers never meant anything good. She called for Thomas, who came shuffling in from the bedroom where he'd been trying to fix a lamp they couldn't afford to replace. "What is it?" he asked, seeing the envelope. "Don't know yet," Margaret said, her voice small. She opened it carefully, sliding her finger under the flap rather than tearing it. Inside was a letter typed on heavy paper, the kind that felt important. "Dear Mr. and Mrs. Thomas Hayes, it is our duty to inform you of the passing of Mr. Howard Delmar Hayes, who died on December 18th. As the executor of Mr. Hayes's estate, we are writing to notify you that you have been named as sole beneficiaries of his remaining property." Margaret looked up at Thomas. "Howard Hayes. That's your uncle, isn't it? Your daddy's brother?" Thomas's face had gone pale. "Yeah, haven't heard from him in near about 40 years. Didn't even know he was still alive." They read the rest of the letter together, Margaret's finger tracing the words as if that would help them make sense. Mr. Hayes's estate consists primarily of one parcel of land and structure located in the unincorporated area of Kettle Hollow, West Virginia. The property includes approximately 14 acres and one shelter structure built in 1976. Mr. Hayes owned the property outright with no outstanding liens or debts. As his only living relatives, you are entitled to claim this property. Please contact our office at your earliest convenience to arrange transfer of the deed. There was more legal language, but Margaret had stopped reading. She looked at Thomas, searching his face for some clue about what this meant. "You remember your Uncle Howard?" she asked. Thomas sat down heavily in the kitchen chair, the wood creaking under his weight. "Barely. He was at our wedding, I think. Maybe. Daddy used to say Howard went crazy after Vietnam, moved up into the mountains and never came back down. We all figured he'd died years ago." "Well, he didn't die years ago," Margaret said softly. "He died last month." They sat in silence for a while, the letter resting between them on the table. Outside, the first snowflakes had started to fall, drifting past the window like tiny ghosts. "Shelter structure," Thomas finally said. "What you reckon that means?" "Could be anything," Margaret replied. "Could be a cabin. Could be a shack. Could be just 4 walls and a dream." Thomas picked up the letter and read it again. 14 acres. That's something at least. "In Kettle Hollow," Margaret said. "You know where that is?" Thomas shook his head. "Never heard of it." By that evening, everyone in Pine Ridge had heard about the Hayes inheritance. News traveled fast in small towns, especially news that involved lawyers and land and people who barely scraped by suddenly coming into something. Thomas made the mistake of mentioning it to Carl at the gas station when he went to buy milk. Carl told his wife. His wife told her sister. Her sister posted about it on Facebook. And by the time Margaret went to the library for her Wednesday shift, 3 different people had already asked her about the mansion she'd inherited. "It's not a mansion," Margaret kept saying. "It's just some land with a shelter on it. We don't even know what kind of shelter." But people heard what they wanted to hear. By Thursday, half the town was congratulating her on her good fortune, and the other half was whispering behind her back about how some people get all the luck while the rest of them worked for every dime. Friday afternoon, Margaret got cornered at the Dollar General by Janet Pritchard, who ran the town's only beauty salon and knew everyone's secrets because they told her while she trimmed their split ends. "Heard about your uncle leaving you that place up in the mountains," Janet said, her voice dripping with something that wasn't quite kindness. "That's real nice. Must be worth something if he held on to it all those years." Margaret shifted the bread and peanut butter she was holding, wishing she could just check out and leave. "We don't know anything about it yet, haven't even seen it." "Well, I heard from Paula, who heard from someone in her church, that the property's been sitting empty for decades," Janet continued. probably falling apart by now. You know how those old places get. Foundation goes, roof caves in, animals move in. Might cost more to tear it down than it's worth. Janet smiled, but her eyes were sharp. Course, you could always sell it. Probably get a few thousand for the land alone. That'd help with your bills, wouldn't it? Margaret felt her cheeks flush. She knew Janet knew about their money troubles. Everybody did. In a town this small, you couldn't hide being poor. It showed in the clothes you wore, the car you drove, the way you skipped the church potluck because you couldn't afford to bring a dish. We'll figure it out, Margaret said quietly, and moved toward the register. That night, sitting at their kitchen table with the lawyer's letter spread out in front of them, Thomas and Margaret made a decision. They'd drive up to Kettle Hollow the next day and see the property for themselves. They needed to know what they were dealing with. Was it worth keeping? Worth selling? Worth anything at all? Thomas called the law firm first thing Saturday morning. The receptionist told him the property was about 2.5 hours northwest, deep in the mountains near the West Virginia and Kentucky border. She gave him directions, warned him the roads got rough past the last town, and said the keys were being held at a small post office in Clayton, the closest thing to civilization near the property. "You sure you want to drive up there?" Margaret asked. "Forecast says more snow coming." Thomas looked out the window at their 15-year-old Honda Civic, rusted at the wheel wells and burning oil. "If we're going to own it, might as well see it." They left at 7 in the morning, the sky still dark and heavy with unfallen snow. Margaret packed sandwiches and a thermos of coffee. Thomas brought a flashlight, a crowbar, and a first aid kit, though he wasn't sure why. Maybe because going into the unknown required tools, even if you didn't know which ones you'd need. The drive took them north on Route 19, then west through towns that got smaller and smaller until they weren't really towns at all, just a gas station and a post office and maybe a church. The mountains rose around them, dark and ancient, their peaks disappearing into low clouds. The roads narrowed, the pavement gave way to gravel. The gravel gave way to dirt packed hard and rutted with ice. Margaret gripped the door handle as Thomas navigated a particularly steep curve. "You sure we're going the right way?" Thomas checked the directions scribbled on a piece of paper. "Should be. Lady said turn at the broken bridge sign." "That's comforting," Margaret muttered. They found Clayton just before noon. It wasn't on any map Margaret had looked at. It was just a wide spot in the road, with a post office the size of a garden shed, a closed-down general store, and 3 houses that looked like they were held together by hope and old paint. The woman at the post office was ancient, maybe 90, with white hair piled high and glasses thick as bottle bottoms. She didn't smile when they walked in. "Help you?" she asked. "We're here to pick up keys," Thomas said. "For the Hayes property, up in Kettle Hollow." The woman's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Recognition, maybe, or warning. "You're the ones inheriting Howard's place?" "Yes, ma'am." She disappeared into the back room and returned with a manila envelope. Inside were 2 old brass keys, heavy and worn smooth. "Property's about 4 miles up the mountain road. You'll see a turn-off marked with a white birch. Road's probably not cleared." "We've got 4-wheel drive," Thomas lied. The woman looked at their Honda Civic through the window and raised an eyebrow. "You're gonna need more than that." She leaned forward. "You know what you're getting into up there?" "No, ma'am," Margaret said honestly. "We don't know anything about it." The old woman studied them for a long moment. Then she said, "Howard Hayes was a strange man. Kept to himself. Came down maybe twice a year for supplies. Never talked to nobody. Some folks said he was crazy. Some folks said he was hiding. Don't know which was true." She handed Margaret the keys. "But that place of his, it's got a feeling to it. Don't stay up there after dark." Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. "Why not?" "Just don't." The woman turned back to her sorting. The conversation was over. Outside, the snow had started again. Thomas loaded the keys into his pocket, and they climbed back into the Civic. Neither of them spoke as they drove the final 4 miles up the mountain road. The trees closed in on both sides, tall pines and bare oaks that blocked out most of the grey sky. The road got worse, full of potholes and loose rocks that pinged against the undercarriage. "There," Margaret said, pointing to a white birch standing alone among the darker trees. Thomas turned onto what could barely be called a road. It was more like a path, 2 tire tracks with dead grass and snow between them. The Civic's engine whined as they climbed higher, the wheels slipping on ice. Twice they nearly got stuck, but Thomas kept going, gripping the steering wheel hard enough that his knuckles went white. And then they saw it. The shelter sat in a clearing at the top of a small ridge, surrounded by snow-covered ground and more trees. It wasn't a cabin, it wasn't a shack, it was something else entirely. The structure was built low into the hillside, made of dark stone and concrete. It looked military, utilitarian, like something designed to withstand a bomb. There were no windows, just one heavy metal door with rust bleeding down the front. A stovepipe jutted from the roof, covered in snow. The whole thing looked like it had been here for centuries, like it had grown out of the mountain itself. Thomas stopped the car and killed the engine. They sat in silence, staring at the structure. "That's not a shelter," Margaret whispered. "That's a bunker." Thomas's hands were still on the steering wheel. What the hell was Uncle Howard doing up here? They got out slowly, their feet crunching through 6 inches of snow. The cold bit at their faces. The wind whispered through the pines, a sound like voices just out of hearing. Thomas approached the door first, pulling the keys from his pocket. The lock was old but well maintained. The key turned smoothly. The door opened with a groan that echoed across the clearing. Warm air rushed out, carrying the smell of wood smoke and old paper, and something else, something Margaret couldn't identify. Thomas clicked on the flashlight and stepped inside. Margaret followed, her heart hammering. The interior was one large room, maybe 20 feet by 30 feet. A wood stove sat in the corner, its fire long dead. A simple cot was pushed against one wall, neatly made with a wool blanket. Shelves lined the walls, filled with canned goods, books, tools, lanterns. A small table held a plate, a cup, and an open book. It looked like someone had just stepped out for a moment and would be back any second. But Howard Hayes had been dead for over a month, and no one was coming back. "He lived here," Margaret said softly. "All these years, alone." Thomas moved deeper into the room, his flashlight sweeping across the space. The place was incredibly organized. Every tool had a place. Every book was shelved alphabetically. There were no personal photos, no decorations, nothing that said anything about who Howard Hayes had been, beyond a man who lived in total isolation. Margaret moved to the bookshelf and ran her finger along the spines. History books mostly, military strategy, survival guides, and dozens of journals, the kind with leather covers and sewn bindings. She pulled one out and opened it. Howard's handwriting was neat, precise, almost mechanical. January 8, 1983. Supplies low. Need to make run to Clayton before next snow. Keeping watch. Patterns unchanged. They haven't found it yet. Margaret felt her skin prickle. They haven't found what? Thomas was examining the floor near the wood stove. He knelt down, his knees cracking. "Margaret, come look at this." She crossed the room and knelt beside him. The floor was made of wide wooden planks, rough-hewn and dark with age. But where Thomas was pointing, there was something odd, a seam in the wood that didn't match the others. It ran in a perfect rectangle, about 3 feet by 4 feet. Thomas pulled out his pocket knife and wedged it into the seam. The wood shifted. He worked his fingers under the edge and pulled. The section of floor lifted, revealing hinges on one side. Beneath the floor was darkness and stone steps leading down. Margaret's breath caught. "What is that?" Thomas shined his flashlight into the opening. The beam disappeared into blackness, illuminating maybe 10 steps before the light gave out. Cold air rushed up from below, carrying a smell like old earth and something metallic. "A cellar," Margaret whispered. But even as she said it, she knew that wasn't right. This wasn't a cellar for storing potatoes and preserves. This was something else, something that had been hidden intentionally. The steps were too carefully carved. The opening was too well concealed. Thomas looked at Margaret. In the dim light of the shelter, his face was pale. "What do you think is down there?" "I don't know," Margaret said, "but I think we need to find out." Outside, the snow had picked up. The wind howled through the trees, shaking the pines and rattling the metal door. The temperature was dropping fast. If they were going to explore what was below, they needed to do it now before the roads became impassable and they got trapped up here in the dark. Thomas tested the first step, solid stone, cold and damp, but secure. He looked back at Margaret one more time. "You coming?" Margaret thought about the warm car waiting outside. She thought about the 2.5-hour drive back to Pine Ridge. She thought about their empty bank account and mounting bills and the way people in town had looked at her when they heard about the inheritance, like she'd been handed something she didn't deserve. And she thought about Howard Hayes, living alone in this bunker for 40 years, writing in journals about watching and patterns and something that hadn't been found yet. "Yeah," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'm coming." Together, they descended into the dark. The stone steps were slick with moisture, each one worn smooth in the center from decades of use. Thomas took them slowly, one hand on the wall for balance, the other holding the flashlight. Margaret followed close behind, her fingers gripping the back of his jacket. The air grew colder as they descended, and their breath came out in white clouds that disappeared into the darkness. 15 steps. Margaret counted them. Then 16, 17. The beam from Thomas's flashlight bounced off stone walls that looked like they'd been carved directly from the mountain itself. This wasn't something Howard had built recently. This had taken years, maybe decades. At step 23, the staircase ended. They stood in a small landing area, facing a massive wooden door reinforced with iron bands. It looked medieval, like something from a castle. Thomas ran his hand over the wood, feeling the grain worn smooth by time and touch. "There's no lock," he said quietly. Margaret stepped closer. He was right. No keyhole, no padlock, just a simple iron handle shaped like a ring. Thomas pulled out the second brass key from the envelope, but there was nowhere to use it. "Maybe it's for something else," Margaret whispered. Thomas grabbed the iron ring and pulled. For a moment, nothing happened. Then slowly, with a groan that seemed to come from the earth itself, the door swung inward. Darkness yawned beyond it, absolute and complete. The flashlight beam stretched into the black and revealed nothing but more darkness. "Howard!" Thomas called out, his voice echoing strangely. "Uncle Howard, you down here?" Silence, then a sound, soft, rhythmic, like water dripping. They stepped through the doorway together. The space beyond was enormous. Margaret could feel it in the way their footsteps echoed, in the way the air moved. Thomas swept the flashlight left, then right. The beam caught something that made him stop, metal, gleaming and reflective. He moved the light slowly, and shapes began to emerge from the darkness. Shelves, rows and rows of metal shelving units, the kind you'd see in a warehouse, each one packed with objects wrapped in cloth, sealed in plastic, organized with the same meticulous care they'd seen upstairs. "What is all this?" Margaret breathed. Thomas walked to the nearest shelf and picked up a wrapped bundle. It was surprisingly heavy. He set it on the ground and carefully peeled back the cloth. Underneath was more protection. Bubble wrap, newspaper dated 1987, and beneath that, something that made both of them catch their breath. A painting, oil on canvas, maybe 2 feet by 3 feet. It showed a woman in a blue dress sitting by a window, sunlight streaming across her face. The style was impressionistic, loose brush strokes and vibrant colors. Even in the dim flashlight beam, it was beautiful. Margaret knelt beside it. "Is that real?" "I don't know," Thomas said. "But look." He pointed to the bottom corner. There, in faded paint, was a signature, and beneath it a small metal plaque attached to the frame with a date and a name Margaret recognized, even though she knew nothing about art. Renoir, 1879. "That can't be real," Margaret whispered. "That can't be a real Renoir." But even as she said it, she knew it looked real. It felt real. The weight of the frame, the way the paint had aged and cracked slightly, the smell of old canvas and linseed oil. Thomas stood up slowly, his knees protesting. He moved the flashlight to the next shelf. More wrapped bundles, dozens of them. He unwrapped another. This one was smaller, a drawing in charcoal, a woman's face, haunting and sad. The signature said, Degas. "Thomas," Margaret said, her voice shaking, "what is this place?" He didn't answer. He was already moving to the next shelf. This one held sculptures, small bronzes wrapped in protective foam. He unwrapped one, a dancer, frozen mid-leap, every muscle rendered in perfect detail. The base had a plaque, Rodin, 1892. Margaret stood on trembling legs and moved deeper into the chamber. The flashlight beam barely penetrated the darkness, but she could see more shelving units stretching back into shadows. How big was this room? How deep into the mountain did it go? She found a light switch on the wall and flipped it, not expecting anything. But somewhere above them, a generator rumbled to life. Fluorescent lights flickered on one by one, harsh and bright after the darkness, and in that light they saw everything. The chamber was massive, easily the size of a basketball court. The ceiling was carved stone, supported by thick wooden beams. The walls were lined with dehumidifiers and climate control units, all still running. And every available surface was covered with shelving, paintings, hundreds of them, sculptures, drawings, antiquities, each one wrapped and labeled with the same careful precision. Margaret saw names she recognized even with her limited knowledge: Monet, Van Gogh, Picasso, Rembrandt. She saw pottery that looked ancient Greek. She saw jewelry in locked cases, gold and precious stones that caught the light like trapped fire. Thomas walked slowly through the aisles, his mouth open, unable to form words. He stopped at a tall shelf in the back corner. This one held books. Not regular books, but manuscripts. Illuminated medieval manuscripts with gold leaf and intricate illustrations. Beside them, clay tablets covered in cuneiform writing, scrolls in Hebrew and Arabic, documents sealed in plastic with dates going back hundreds of years. "Margaret," he finally managed. "Margaret, come here." She found him standing in front of a locked cabinet. Through the glass front, she could see neat stacks of gold bars, each one stamped with official-looking seals. Nazi gold, read a small typed label, recovered from Österreich, 1946. Margaret felt dizzy. She grabbed Thomas's arm to steady herself. "This isn't possible. This can't be real." But it was real. She could see it, touch it, smell the must and age of it. This was a collection worth millions, maybe tens of millions, maybe more. Thomas moved to a wooden desk in the corner of the room. It was the only furniture in the entire chamber besides the shelving units. On top sat a ledger, the kind with a leather cover and marbled edges. Beside it, a stack of manila folders, each one labeled with a year and a location. He opened the ledger with shaking hands. The pages were filled with Howard's neat handwriting. Each entry listed an object, where it came from, when it was acquired, and its estimated value. Thomas flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning the numbers. $60,000, $120,000, $350,000. The numbers kept climbing. He flipped to the back of the ledger, where Howard had written a summary in larger letters, underlined twice. Total collection value as of December 1st, $245,372,000. Thomas sat down hard in the desk chair, Margaret read over his shoulder, her hand covering her mouth. $245 million. They'd inherited $245 million worth of art, antiquities, and precious metals from a man who lived alone in a bunker in the mountains. "How?" Margaret whispered. "How did he get all this?" Thomas opened one of the manila folders. Inside were photographs, documents, news clippings yellowed with age. The folder was labeled Austria, 1946 through 1948. The first photograph showed a young man in an American military uniform. He was tall and lean, standing in front of a bombed-out building. Margaret looked closer. The face was familiar, younger, harder, but familiar. "That's Howard," she said. "That's your Uncle Howard." Thomas pulled out more photos. Howard in uniform with other soldiers. Howard standing guard outside a building with signs in German. Howard loading crates onto a truck. And then newspaper clippings, stories about recovered Nazi treasure. Art stolen during the war and hidden in salt mines and castles. Monuments men, the headlines called them. Soldiers tasked with finding and protecting cultural treasures. "He was a monuments man," Thomas said slowly. "He was one of the soldiers who recovered stolen art." Margaret pulled out another folder. This one was labeled Vienna, 1968 through 1973. Inside were more photographs, but these were different. Howard was older now, out of uniform, standing in what looked like warehouses and government storage facilities. There were receipts, transfer documents, correspondence with museums and government agencies. One letter, typed on official letterhead from the Austrian Ministry of Culture, caught Margaret's eye. She read it aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. "Dear Mr. Hayes, we regret to inform you that despite your repeated requests, we cannot accept custody of the items in question at this time. The provenance is unclear, and the legal complications surrounding ownership prevent us from taking possession. We recommend you contact the International Commission for the Recovery of Stolen Art." Signed, Hans Müller, Director. Thomas opened another folder, and another. Each one told the same story. Howard had recovered art and artifacts that had been stolen by the Nazis. He'd tried to return them to their rightful owners or to museums, but over and over he'd been turned away. Ownership was disputed. Countries argued over who had the legal right to pieces. Museums didn't want the liability. Families had been killed or scattered, and heirs couldn't be found. So Howard had kept them. He'd stored them. He'd protected them. For 40 years. Margaret pulled out a journal from the bottom drawer of the desk. It was newer than the others they'd found upstairs, dated just 3 months ago. She opened to a random page and began to read. September 15th. Getting weaker. Doctor says I don't have long. Need to make arrangements. Collection must be protected. Can't let it fall into wrong hands. Government will seize it. Auction houses will scatter it. Needs to stay together. Needs to go to someone who will understand. She flipped forward a few pages. October 3rd. Contacted lawyer in Charleston. Will leave everything to Thomas's boy. He's only family left. Good people. Struggling but honest. They'll know what to do. They'll keep it safe until the world is ready. What happens next will turn this night upside down, reveal a truth nobody expected, and remind us why sometimes the quietest voices carry the most power. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. Margaret looked up at Thomas, tears streaming down her face. He left this to us because he trusted us. Thomas's eyes were red. He took the journal from her hands and kept reading. October 29th. Sold most of my army pension to keep climate control running. Worth it. These pieces survived one war. They'll survive another. Someone once told me that art is how we remember we're human. Can't let that be lost. He closed the journal and set it down carefully. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The dehumidifiers whirred. Somewhere in the distance, water dripped steadily onto stone. "We can't tell anyone about this," Thomas finally said. "Not yet." Margaret nodded. "If people find out, they'll come. Government, collectors, thieves, they'll take it all. We need time to figure out what to do, how to protect it." Thomas looked around the chamber, his eyes taking in the magnitude of what they now owned. "Howard spent 40 years keeping this safe. We can't let him down." They spent the next 2 hours exploring the chamber more carefully. Margaret found a file cabinet filled with provenance documents. Each piece in the collection had a paper trail. Photographs of where it was found, testimony from survivors, expert authentication, historical records. Howard had documented everything. Thomas discovered a second, smaller room behind a false wall. This one held military memorabilia, medals, uniforms, maps, and in the corner a strongbox. He used the second brass key from the envelope, and it opened. Inside were letters, dozens of them. Letters from Howard to various museums, governments, and organizations. And responses. Always the same. "We cannot accept at this time. Legal complications prevent. Ownership disputed." One letter, handwritten on plain paper, made Thomas stop. It was addressed to someone named Rachel Goldstein, dated 1977. "Dear Mrs. Goldstein, I located a painting that belonged to your family before the war. It's a small oil by a Dutch master, dated 1632. I've enclosed a photograph. If this is yours, I would like to return it. No payment needed. It's simply the right thing to do. With respect, Howard Hayes." Below it, a response on different paper in shaky handwriting. "Dear Mr. Hayes, yes, this belonged to my grandmother. It hung in her dining room in Amsterdam. I thought it was lost forever when they took her away. I am 81 years old now and cannot travel to America. But knowing it survived, knowing someone cared enough to look for me, that is enough. Please keep it safe. You are a good man. Rachel Goldstein." Thomas's hands shook as he read. This wasn't about money. It had never been about money for Howard. It was about remembering, about honoring, about refusing to let evil win by erasing beauty from the world. Margaret found him standing there, the letter still in his hands. "You okay?" "No," he said honestly. "I'm not." She wrapped her arms around him, and they stood together in that underground chamber, surrounded by centuries of human creativity and decades of one man's solitary mission. They were 72 and 74 years old, broke, forgotten by most of the world, and they'd just inherited a responsibility so massive it made their knees weak. "What are we going to do?" Margaret whispered against his shoulder. "I don't know," Thomas said, "but we're going to do it right." They climbed the stone steps slowly, every joint aching, every muscle protesting. Upstairs, the shelter felt different now, smaller, simpler. They understood now why Howard had lived this way. Every penny he had went to protecting what was below. The climate control, the generators, the security. He'd sacrificed comfort, companionship, a normal life, all to keep faith with promises made in the ashes of a war that ended before most people alive today were born. Outside, the snow had stopped. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Their Honda Civic sat exactly where they'd left it, covered in a fresh layer of white. The world looked peaceful, untouched, normal. But nothing was normal anymore. Thomas locked the bunker door. Margaret checked twice to make sure it was secure. They'd left everything exactly as they'd found it. They'd taken nothing, disturbed nothing. The only evidence they'd been there at all were their footprints in the dust and the lingering smell of their fear and wonder. The drive back down the mountain was treacherous. The temperature had dropped and the dirt road was now a sheet of ice. Thomas drove 10 miles an hour, his hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel. Margaret stared out the window, seeing nothing. Her mind kept replaying images from the chamber. The Renoir with its woman in blue, the Rodin dancer frozen in eternal motion, the gold bars stamped with swastikas, the letters from Holocaust survivors, The careful notation in Howard's ledger, $245 million. They could pay off their debt, buy a real house, help their kids, never worry about money again. But that money came with strings attached. It came with responsibility. It came with the weight of history and the ghosts of millions of people who died, so that art could be stolen, hoarded, lost. By the time they reached Clayton, it was full dark. The post office was closed. The old woman was gone. The three houses had lights in their windows, warm and yellow against the black night. Thomas didn't stop. He kept driving. They didn't talk during the 2.5-hour drive home. What was there to say? Words felt too small for what they'd seen, what they now carried. Margaret dozed fitfully, her head against the cold window. Thomas drove on autopilot, following the dark roads by instinct. It was almost 10 o'clock when they pulled into Pine Ridge. The town was asleep. Even the gas station was closed. Thomas parked in front of their rental house and killed the engine. They sat in silence, neither one ready to move yet. "We can't tell the kids," Margaret finally said. "Not yet. Not until we know what we're doing." Thomas nodded. "We tell no one. Far as anyone knows, we drove up there, looked at an old bunker, decided it wasn't worth keeping." "People will ask questions." "Let them ask," Thomas said. "We don't owe anyone answers." They went inside. The house felt too warm after the cold mountain air. Margaret made tea neither of them drank. Thomas sat at the kitchen table and stared at his hands. They were the same hands that had framed houses for 40 years. The same hands that had changed diapers and fixed bicycles and held Margaret when her mother died. Ordinary hands. But today those hands had touched a Renoir, had held letters from Holocaust survivors, had unlocked a chamber containing $250 million in stolen history. "Thomas," Margaret said quietly, "I'm scared." "Me too." "What if we do the wrong thing? What if we mess this up?" He reached across the table and took her hand. His skin was rough and worn, but his grip was steady. "We've spent 51 years doing the right thing, raising good kids, paying our bills, treating people decent. We're not going to stop now." Margaret squeezed his hand. "Howard believed in us, even though he barely knew us." "Maybe that's why he picked us," Thomas said. "Because we weren't important. Because nobody would look at two broke old people and think they had anything worth stealing." They went to bed but didn't sleep. Margaret lay staring at the ceiling, listening to Thomas breathe beside her. She thought about their empty bank account, the bills coming due, the way Janet Pritchard had looked at her in the Dollar General, that mixture of pity and satisfaction. Everyone in town thought they'd inherited junk, a worthless shelter on worthless land. They'd probably get sympathy for a few weeks, and then people would forget. The Hayes who inherited nothing and stayed poor. Except they hadn't inherited nothing. They'd inherited everything. And somehow they had to figure out how to protect it, honor it, and maybe, if they were smart and careful and lucky, use it to do some good in the world. Because Howard Hayes had spent 40 years alone in the mountains, keeping faith with people he'd never met. People who died in camps and gas chambers. People whose art and treasures and memories were stolen and scattered. He'd given up family, comfort, a normal life, all to preserve beauty in a world that had tried to destroy it. And now that burden had passed to them. Two elderly people with bad backs and empty pockets and hearts full of something they couldn't quite name. Not greed, not excitement. Something closer to duty. Or maybe calling. Margaret turned on her side and watched the streetlight outside cast shadows on the wall. She thought about the woman in the blue dress in the Renoir painting, wondered who she'd been. Wondered if anyone alive still remembered her name. "Art is how we remember we're human," Howard had written. And he was right. Every painting in that chamber, every sculpture, every piece of pottery and jewelry and manuscript, they were proof that humans could create beauty even in darkness, that we could love and hope and dream even when the world burned. And somehow Margaret and Thomas had been chosen to protect that proof. Them, of all people. "You still awake?" Thomas whispered in the dark. "Yeah, we're going to need help," he said. "Eventually. Lawyers, probably. Experts. People who know about this stuff." "But not yet." "No," he agreed. "Not yet. First, we need to understand what we have. Read all of Howard's documents. Figure out what he wanted, what he tried to do." "And then?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "And then we do what he couldn't. We find a way to get these things back to where they belong, back to the families, back to the world." Margaret felt tears on her cheeks. "That could take years. We might not even live long enough." "Then we do what we can," Thomas said, "and we make sure someone continues after we're gone. Someone who'll care as much as Howard did, as much as we do." Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and silent, covering the town in white, covering their old Honda Civic and the hardware store and the Dollar General and the library where Margaret worked 10 hours a week for minimum wage, covering everything in a blanket of temporary perfection. But underneath, things remained as they were, broken and struggling and real, just like underneath a frozen mountain, in a chamber carved from stone. $245 million in art and history waited in the dark, protected by climate control and locks and the faith of one dead soldier, and now protected by two people who had no idea what they were doing but were determined to try anyway. Because sometimes that's all you can do. Try, care. Refuse to give up even when it's easier, even when nobody's watching. Even when you're 72 and 74 years old with more days behind you than ahead. Margaret finally fell asleep just before dawn, her hand in Thomas's hand, their breath rising and falling together in the dark. And in her dreams, she walked through a gallery filled with light, surrounded by paintings of people who smiled at her like old friends, welcoming her to their world, trusting her to remember their names. Monday morning came too fast. Margaret woke with a headache that sat behind her eyes like a stone. She'd slept maybe 3 hours total, her dreams full of locked doors and paintings that whispered secrets she couldn't quite hear. Thomas was already up, sitting at the kitchen table with cold coffee and the classified section of the newspaper spread out in front of him. He wasn't reading it, just staring. "We have to act normal," Margaret said, filling the kettle. "People are going to ask about the property." "I know. We tell them it's nothing. Old bunker, no electricity, not worth the trouble of keeping." Thomas nodded. "Already thought about that. We say we're trying to figure out if we can sell the land, maybe get a few thousand for it." Margaret poured her coffee and sat across from him. In the morning light, he looked older than he had 2 days ago. The weight of what they'd found had settled into the lines of his face, pulling at the corners of his mouth. "Thomas, what if someone else knows about it? What if Howard told someone? He lived alone for 40 years. Who would he tell?" "I don't know, but people don't just hide $245 million without someone noticing. The government, the military, somebody has to know." Thomas rubbed his face with both hands. "We need to go back up there, go through all his papers, figure out who knew what and when." "When?" "Soon. Today, maybe, before the next storm hits." But before they could make plans, there was a knock at the door. Sharp. Official. Margaret's heart jumped into her throat. Thomas met her eyes across the table, and she saw her own fear reflected there. He stood slowly, walked to the door, opened it. On the porch stood a man Margaret had never seen before, mid-40s, clean-cut, wearing a heavy wool coat and polished shoes that had no business on the muddy streets of Pine Ridge. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Thomas Hayes." "That's me." "My name is David Pritchett. I'm with the Treasury Department's Art Recovery Division." He pulled out a badge, held it up just long enough for Thomas to see the official seal. I was hoping I could ask you a few questions about the property you recently inherited from Howard Hayes. Margaret felt the room tilt. She gripped the edge of the table to steady herself. Thomas's voice stayed calm. What about it? May I come in? Rather you didn't. My wife's not feeling well. Pritchett's smile thinned. I understand. I'll be brief. We've been monitoring Mr. Howard Hayes for quite some time. He was a person of interest in several ongoing investigations related to missing art from World War II. Now that he's deceased and the property has transferred to you, we need to ensure that any items of historical significance are properly documented and returned to their rightful owners. There's nothing up there but an old bunker, Thomas said. Some canned goods, a cot, few books. We're thinking of selling the land if we can find a buyer. Pritchett pulled a small notebook from his pocket. You visited the property Saturday, is that correct? Thomas's jaw tightened. How do you know that? We have people in the area, standard procedure when monitoring assets of interest. Did you explore the entire property, all structures above and below ground? Wasn't much to explore. Like I said, just a bunker. We were only there maybe an hour. And you found nothing unusual? No artwork, no documents, no storage areas? No, sir, just dust and cobwebs and a dead man's empty house. Pritchett studied Thomas for a long moment. Then he handed him a business card. If you do find anything at all, you're legally obligated to report it. Hiding or selling items of cultural significance is a federal crime. The penalties are severe. Prison time, asset seizure, the works. Thomas took the card without looking at it. Appreciate the information. One more thing, Pritchett said. We'll need to conduct our own search of the property. I'll be filing the paperwork this week. Should have authorization within 10 days. I trust you'll grant us access. It's my property now. Don't see how I can stop you. Pritchett smiled again. Oh, you can't. The authorization isn't a request. It's a formality. We'll be conducting the search whether you cooperate or not, but cooperation tends to go better for everyone involved. He tipped his head to Margaret, who was still standing frozen by the table. Ma'am, hope you feel better soon. Then he was gone, walking down their driveway to a black sedan parked at the curb. Thomas closed the door and leaned against it, his face pale. They know, Margaret whispered. They know something's there. They suspect. They don't know for sure. Thomas, they're going to search. They're going to find everything. He moved to the window and watched the black sedan pull away. Not if we move it first. Margaret stared at him. Move it? Move $245 million worth of art? Where? How? We can't even afford a storage unit. I don't know yet, but Howard kept it hidden for 40 years. There has to be a reason the government didn't find it before. There has to be something we're missing. They drove back up to Kettle Hollow that afternoon, taking back roads and checking constantly to make sure no one was following. The sky was clear for once, painfully blue, and the mountains stood sharp against it. Margaret kept Pritchett's business card in her pocket, the edges already worn from her nervous fingers. At the bunker, everything looked exactly as they'd left it. The door was still locked. The snow around it was undisturbed except for their tracks from Saturday. Thomas worked the key in the lock, and they went inside. This time, they didn't go straight to the underground chamber. Instead, Thomas went through Howard's belongings upstairs with methodical care. He opened every book, checked every shelf, looked behind every piece of furniture. Margaret went through the journals, reading Howard's careful entries, looking for anything that explained how he'd kept this secret for so long. She found it in a journal dated 1976, the year the bunker was built. March 23rd. Construction complete. Builder thinks it's just a shelter. Doesn't know about the excavation underneath. Paid him cash. He won't ask questions. Filed all permits under agricultural storage. County approved without inspection. Remote location helps. No neighbors to wonder. As long as I pay property taxes and don't cause trouble, nobody will ever know. Margaret kept reading. Howard had been brilliant in his paranoia. He'd built the upper structure first, got all the permits, had everything inspected and approved. Then, after the builders left, he'd spent years excavating the chamber below, working alone, hauling out stone and dirt a bucket at a time. No one knew it existed because it wasn't on any plans, any blueprints, any official records. The bunker was registered as agricultural storage. The county records showed a simple single-room structure. There was no mention of stairs, no mention of chambers, no mention of climate control equipment. On paper, it was just another mountain shelter, not worth anyone's attention. "Thomas," she called out, "I found something." He came over and she showed him the journal entry. His eyes widened as he read. "So officially, legally, there's nothing down there?" "Not according to any government records," Margaret said, "which means when Pritchett gets his authorization to search, he's only authorized to search what's on the official plans. And if we don't show them the door in the floor, they won't know to look for it." Thomas sat down hard on the cot. "But they'll have dogs, probably. Equipment that can see through walls. They'll find it eventually." "Maybe," Margaret said. "Or maybe Howard designed it so they couldn't. Look at this." She flipped forward several pages. Howard had drawn detailed diagrams of the chamber below. The ceiling was lined with lead sheeting left over from medical facilities being demolished in the 50s. The walls were solid mountain stone, 10 feet thick in places. The entrance was under the floor, hidden by wood that matched the rest of the planks exactly. Even the hinges were recessed and invisible unless you knew where to look. "He built a vault that couldn't be detected from outside," Margaret breathed. "X-rays won't penetrate. Ground-penetrating radar will just show solid stone. Heat signatures won't register through all that insulation. So if we don't tell them it's there, they won't find it. Not unless they rip up every floorboard in the place, and they'd need a reason to do that." They looked at each other. The solution was obvious and terrifying. They could let the government search, let them poke around the upper bunker, take photographs, write their reports, find nothing. And after the investigation closed, after everyone decided there was no hidden treasure, they'd be free to figure out what to do with the collection on their own terms. But it meant lying to federal agents. It meant obstruction of justice, probably. It meant risk. "If we get caught," Thomas said slowly, "we go to prison." "If we tell them the truth, they take everything," Margaret replied. "They'll seize it all as evidence in ongoing investigations. It'll sit in a government warehouse for years while lawyers argue. Howard didn't want that. That's why he hid it in the first place." Thomas stood up and walked to the window. Outside, a hawk circled in the blue sky, riding thermals, free. "He trusted us to do the right thing." "And what is the right thing?" Margaret asked. "Let the government take it and lose it in bureaucracy? Or keep it hidden until we can figure out how to return it to the families like Howard wanted?" "I don't know," Thomas admitted. "I honest to God don't know." They spent another hour in the bunker, looking for anything else that might help them understand what they should do. In a metal box under the cot, Margaret found letters, dozens of them, responses from Holocaust survivors and their descendants. People Howard had contacted over the years, trying to return stolen art. She read them aloud to Thomas, her voice breaking on almost everyone. "Dear Mr. Hayes, thank you for finding my grandfather's menorah. Knowing it survived the camps means more than I can say. I cannot travel to get it, but please keep it safe. Knowing you care is enough. Mr. Hayes, the painting you located belonged to my mother. She died in Auschwitz. I thought everything from our old life was destroyed. You've given me back a piece of her. I'm 93 years old and have no heirs. Please donate it to the Holocaust Museum in my family's name. With gratitude, Sarah Levinson." "Dear Howard, we found your address through a connection at Yad Vashem. The sculpture you recovered was taken from our family home in Prague in 1939. There are 7 of us left, scattered across 4 countries. We cannot agree on who should have it. Perhaps you should keep it safe until we can. Thank you for remembering us." Thomas's eyes were wet by the time Margaret finished. They trusted him. All these people, they trusted him to do what museums and governments couldn't or wouldn't do. "And now they're trusting us," Margaret said. That night, back in Pine Ridge, they barely spoke. The weight of their decision pressed down like physical force. They could do the safe thing, the legal thing, and hand everything over. Or they could do what they believed was the right thing and risk everything. Margaret made dinner. Neither of them ate. Thomas tried to watch television but couldn't focus. At 9 o'clock, their daughter called. Her name was Jennifer, and she lived in Charlotte with her husband and 2 kids. They hadn't told her about the inheritance yet. "Hey, Mama," Jennifer said, her voice bright. "How are you?" "Fine, baby. How are the kids?" "Driving me crazy. Listen, I wanted to ask you something. Jake's parents want us to come visit for Christmas this year, but I told them we always spend it with you and Daddy. That's still happening, right?" Margaret felt her throat tighten. Christmas was 10 months away, but Jennifer was already planning, already making sure her parents weren't forgotten. "Of course, honey. We'd love to see you." "Good, because Jake's getting a bonus this year, and I want to give you some money. I know things have been tight." "Jennifer, you don't have to." "I want to, Mama. You and Daddy have been there for us every time we needed help. Let us help you for once." After they hung up, Margaret sat at the kitchen table and cried, not from sadness, but from the impossible weight of it all. Her daughter wanted to give them money they didn't need anymore, except they did need it, because the money they had access to was $245 million they couldn't touch without going to prison. Thomas found her there and held her while she sobbed. "What are we doing?" she asked against his shoulder. "What are we becoming?" "We're doing what we have to do," he said. But he didn't sound convinced. The next morning, Janet Pritchard cornered Margaret at the library. Margaret had been reshelving books in the local history section, trying to lose herself in the familiar rhythm of work. But Janet appeared at the end of the aisle, arms crossed, eyebrows raised. "So," Janet said, "tell me about the inheritance. What was up there?" Margaret didn't turn around. "Not much. Old bunker, some junk. We might sell the land if we can." "That's it? That's all?" "That's all." "Seems like a long drive for nothing," Janet said. "Heard you went back up there yesterday, too. Must be something worth looking at." Margaret's hands stilled on the books. "How'd you hear that?" "Pete saw your car heading north on 19. Said you looked like you were in a hurry." Small towns, everyone watching everyone. Margaret forced herself to smile as she turned around. "Just wanted to look again, make sure we didn't miss anything valuable." "And did you?" "No, Janet. No family treasures, no hidden gold, no reason for anyone to care." But Janet's eyes were sharp. "Funny thing, a government man came through town yesterday asking questions. Said he was looking for the Hayes place. Wouldn't say why." Margaret's heart hammered. "I don't know anything about that." "Sure you don't," Janet smiled, but it was cold. "Just seems odd is all. Government men don't usually care about empty bunkers unless there's a reason." After Janet left, Margaret had to sit down. Her hands were shaking. If Janet was talking, the whole town would be talking. And if the whole town was talking, more people would start asking questions. More people would start paying attention. That afternoon, when Margaret got home, there was a note taped to their front door. Plain paper, printed in block letters. "We know what you found. You have until Friday to make the right choice. Give it back or face the consequences. No signature, no contact information, just a threat." Thomas read it 3 times. "Who would send this?" "I don't know. Could be anyone. Could be the government trying to scare us. Could be someone else who knows about the collection." "What do we do?" Margaret crumpled the note in her fist. "We don't let them intimidate us. We stick to the plan. Let the government search. Find nothing and wait. But that night, someone broke into their car. They didn't take anything. They just went through the glove box, looked under the seats, searched for something. The next morning, Margaret found her library locker had been forced open. Again, nothing taken. Just searched. Someone was looking for proof, looking for documentation, looking for anything that would confirm what they suspected. On Thursday, Thomas drove up to Kettle Hollow alone. Margaret stayed home, worried that if they both went, it would look suspicious. He spent 6 hours at the bunker, going through every document, every letter, every journal entry. He photographed pages with his old digital camera. He made notes. He tried to understand what Howard had truly wanted. In one journal from 1993, he found an entry that made him stop cold. August 4th. Realize today that I'll never finish this. I'm 68 years old and in poor health. Been working on this for almost 50 years. Contacted over 200 families. Returned maybe 30 pieces. The rest are stuck in legal limbo. Some families dead. Some countries refusing cooperation. Some pieces so controversial nobody wants to touch them. Thought I could fix this. Thought if I just worked hard enough, cared enough, it would matter. But the world doesn't care about old art and old promises. The world moves on. Maybe I should too. Maybe I should just destroy it all. Let it end with me. But the next entry, dated 3 days later, said something different. August 7th. Decided I can't give up. These pieces survived because someone loved them enough to create them. They survived war and theft and decades of hiding. They deserve better than destruction. Even if I can't return them all, even if I fail, at least I tried. At least I kept faith. That has to count for something. Thomas sat in the dim light of the bunker and understood. Howard had known he might not succeed, but he'd refused to give up. He'd kept going because the alternative was betraying everything he believed in. And now Thomas and Margaret faced the same choice. That evening, Thomas told Margaret what he'd found. They sat in their living room with the curtains drawn, speaking in whispers, even though no one could hear them. "We can't give up either," Thomas said. "If we hand this over to the government, it betrays everything Howard worked for, everything he sacrificed. But if we keep hiding it, we're breaking the law. Maybe some laws deserve to be broken." Margaret looked at him, shocked. In 51 years of marriage, she'd never heard Thomas say anything like that. He was the most law-abiding person she knew. He stopped at stop signs even when no one was around. He reported every penny of income on their taxes. He returned shopping carts to the corral. "You don't mean that," she said. "Don't I?" Thomas leaned forward, his voice urgent. "Margaret, the government had their chance. Howard contacted them dozens of times. They brushed him off, told him it was too complicated, too controversial, too much trouble. They didn't care about returning these pieces to families. They cared about avoiding lawsuits and bad publicity. So Howard took responsibility, and now we have to. But how? We're two old people with no money and no power. How are we supposed to succeed where the government failed?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I don't know, but we have to try." Friday came. The day the anonymous note had mentioned. The day they were supposed to make the right choice. Thomas and Margaret spent the morning at home, waiting. Waiting for another threat. Waiting for something to happen. At 2 o'clock, there was a knock at the door. Margaret answered. On the porch stood 3 people she didn't recognize, an older woman, maybe 60, with salt and pepper hair, a middle-aged man in a yarmulke, and a young woman, barely 30, holding a folder. "Mrs. Hayes?" the older woman asked. "My name is Ruth Klein. I'm with the World Jewish Restitution Organization. May we speak with you about the property you inherited from Howard Hayes?" Margaret's mouth went dry. "How did you know about that?" "Mr. Hayes contacted us several times over the years. He believed some items in his possession belonged to families affected by the Holocaust. When we heard he'd passed and left the property to relatives, We wanted to reach out, to offer our help. Margaret looked back at Thomas, who had come to stand behind her. He nodded slightly. "Come in," Margaret said. They sat in the living room, these strangers who had come from wherever they'd come from, and they spoke softly about Howard Hayes, about his letters, about his mission, about the dozens of families he'd tried to help over 40 years. "He was one of the good ones," Ruth said. "There are so many who found things and kept quiet, who sold on the black market or destroyed evidence to avoid complications. But Howard, he tried. He really tried." The young woman, whose name was Leah, opened her folder. "We have records of 18 items Mr. Hayes recovered that belong to families in our database. We've been trying to locate these items for years. If you've found them in the property, we'd like to help arrange their return to the surviving relatives." Margaret and Thomas looked at each other. This was the moment. They could lie, say they'd found nothing, or they could trust these people the way Howard had tried to trust them. Thomas made the decision. "We found something, but we need your help to protect it." "Protect it from whom?" the man in the yarmulke asked. His name was Isaac, and he was a lawyer. "From everyone," Thomas said. "From the government, from thieves, from anyone who wants to seize it or exploit it or make it disappear into bureaucracy." Ruth leaned forward. "Tell us what you found." So they did. Not everything. Not the full scope, but enough. They told them about the underground chamber, about the art and artifacts, about Howard's documentation, about the treasure agent who'd already come asking questions, about the threats and the searches and the impossible weight of trying to do the right thing. When they finished, the room was silent for a long time. Finally, Isaac spoke. "If you found what I think you found, you're in significant legal danger. But you're also sitting on the most important collection of recovered Holocaust art to be discovered in the last 30 years. "Can you help us?" Margaret asked. Ruth smiled gently. "That's why we're here." Ruth Klein became their lifeline. Over the next 3 days, she and her team worked with Thomas and Margaret to document everything in the underground chamber. They brought authentication experts who drove up from Washington, historians who flew in from New York, specialists in provenance research who came from as far as Tel Aviv. Each one was sworn to secrecy. Each one was vetted by Isaac, the lawyer, who made sure they signed non-disclosure agreements thick as phone books. The work was slow and meticulous. Every piece had to be photographed from multiple angles. Every document had to be scanned. Every label Howard had written had to be cross-referenced with his journals and the historical record. They set up portable lights in the chamber, and the old stone walls glowed like the inside of a cathedral. Margaret watched a woman named Dr. Sarah Feldman examine the Renoir, the woman in the blue dress. Dr. Feldman was maybe 70, with careful hands and reading glasses that kept sliding down her nose. She spent 2 hours on that one painting, studying the brushstrokes, the signature, the way the paint had aged and cracked. Finally, she looked up. "It's authentic. This is Renoir's Woman at Window, painted in 1879. It was stolen from a private collection in Paris in 1943. The family has been searching for it for 8 decades. "They're still alive?" Margaret asked. "The original owners died in Bergen-Belsen, but their grandson lives in Lyon. He's 78 years old. His grandmother used to tell him about this painting when he was a child. He thought it was lost forever." Margaret felt tears sting her eyes. "Can we give it back to him?" "That's why we're here." Piece by piece, the story of the collection emerged. Howard had been part of a Monuments Men unit that operated in Austria and Germany from 1945 through 1949. He'd helped recover thousands of pieces of stolen art. Most had been returned through official channels, sent to museums or repatriation centers, but dozens had fallen through the cracks. Ownership disputes, missing documentation, countries that didn't cooperate, families that couldn't be located. Howard had taken responsibility for the pieces no one else wanted to deal with. He'd spent his own money to store and protect them. He dedicated his life to finding the rightful owners. And when the government and museums refused to help, when bureaucracy made it impossible, he'd built his own vault and waited. Waited for a time when the world might be ready to do the right thing. He was extraordinary, Ruth said one evening. They were sitting in the bunker's main room, exhausted from another long day of cataloguing. Most people would have sold these pieces, made millions, lived comfortably, but Howard chose to live like this. She gestured around the sparse room. He chose poverty and isolation to keep faith with people he'd never met. Thomas nodded slowly. He was my uncle, and I never knew him, never appreciated what he was doing. How could you? Ruth said gently. He couldn't tell anyone. The moment word got out, people would have come for it. Thieves, collectors, governments. He had to stay silent to keep it safe. On the fourth day, David Pritchett returned. He brought 5 other agents, all in dark suits and serious expressions. They had authorization papers, search warrants, equipment in metal cases. Thomas met them at the door of the bunker, Margaret beside him. "Mr. Hayes," Pritchett said, "we're here to conduct our authorized search of the property. I trust you'll cooperate." "Of course," Thomas said. His voice was steady. "But I need to warn you, there's not much to see." They let the agents in, watched them photograph every corner of the main room, watched them use some kind of electronic device to scan the walls, watched them bring in a dog that sniffed around the cot, the shelves, the wood stove. The dog found nothing of interest. It sat down by the door and yawned. Pritchett walked the perimeter of the room slowly, his eyes sharp. He stopped at the floor where the hidden door was. Margaret's heart hammered so hard she thought everyone could hear it. Pritchett knelt down, ran his hand over the floorboards. The seam was invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. "These floorboards original?" he asked. "Far as I know," Thomas said. "My uncle built this place in 1976. Pritchett stood up, dusted off his knees. He looked around one more time, then at Thomas. "You're certain you found nothing unusual here? No storage areas? No hidden compartments?" "Positive," Thomas said. "It's just what you see." The search took 3 hours. They went through everything, opened every box, checked every shelf, looked behind every piece of furniture. They found exactly what the official records said they'd find: an agricultural storage structure with basic living quarters. Nothing more. Before they left, Pritchett handed Thomas another business card. "If you do find anything, the offer still stands. Cooperation means leniency." "Noted," Thomas said. They watched the black vehicles drive away down the mountain. When the sound of the engines faded completely, Margaret let out a breath she'd been holding for 3 hours. "They didn't find it," she whispered. "No," Thomas said. "They didn't." Inside, Ruth and her team had been waiting in the underground chamber with the lights off and the door sealed. When Thomas gave the all clear, they emerged like survivors from a bunker, which Margaret supposed they were. "That was close," Isaac said, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cold. "If they'd decided to pull up those floorboards—" "But they didn't," Ruth interrupted. "They followed their authorization, found nothing matching their expectations, and left. Now we have time." "Time for what?" Margaret asked. "To do this right." Over the following weeks, the plan took shape. Isaac worked with international lawyers to create a legal framework. They would establish a foundation, a non-profit organization dedicated to Holocaust restitution. The foundation would take possession of the collection, not as owners but as custodians. They would work with families, survivors, and their descendants to verify ownership and arrange returns. "This way," Isaac explained, "the collection doesn't belong to you personally. It belongs to the foundation, which belongs to the mission. The government can't seize it as personal assets because you don't own it. You're just facilitating its protection and eventual repatriation." "Is that legal?" Thomas asked. "It's complicated," Isaac admitted. "But we have precedent. Several similar foundations exist for Nazi-looted art. As long as we're transparent about our mission and follow proper procedures, we should be protected. Should be? Margaret repeated. There are no guarantees in this kind of work, Ruth said. But it's the best option we have. The foundation was registered under the name the Hayes Restitution Trust. Thomas and Margaret were listed as founders, but not as directors. That role went to Ruth and a board of Holocaust scholars, art historians, and descendants of survivors. The foundation's stated mission was simple: to locate, authenticate, and return art and cultural property stolen during the Holocaust. They filed all the proper paperwork, paid all the proper fees, made everything official and transparent, and then they very quietly began the real work. The first return happened in March, 4 months after Thomas and Margaret first opened that underground chamber. The piece was a small bronze sculpture, a dancer, created by a lesser-known French artist in 1928. It had belonged to a Jewish family in Brussels. The father had been a jeweler, the mother a schoolteacher. They'd had 3 children. All of them died in 1943, but the father's brother had survived. He'd emigrated to Argentina, married, had children. His grandson, a man named Alejandro Goldstein, lived in Buenos Aires. He was 62 years old and had spent years researching his family's history. Ruth contacted him, explained what they'd found, sent photographs. Alejandro wept on the phone when he saw the sculpture. It had been in his great-grandparents' dining room. His grandfather had described it in detail, over and over, until the memory became almost more real than the object itself. Margaret and Thomas watched via video call as the sculpture was delivered to Alejandro's home. He held it with shaking hands, touching it like it might disappear. His wife and children gathered around. His grandson, maybe 8 years old, asked what it was. "This is memory," Alejandro said, his voice thick. "This is proof that we existed, that we mattered, that we created beautiful things." After the call ended, Margaret sat in the bunker and cried. Not from sadness, but from overwhelming purpose. This was why Howard had sacrificed everything. This was what it meant to keep faith. But not everyone was pleased with what they were doing. In April, David Pritchett showed up at their house in Pine Ridge again. This time, he wasn't alone. He brought someone from the State Department and someone from Interpol. "We've heard rumors," Pritchett said, standing on their porch. "Rumors that you've established some kind of foundation. Rumors that you're claiming to possess recovered Holocaust art." "It's not a rumor," Thomas said. "It's public record. The Hayes Restitution Trust. We filed all the paperwork." "And where did this art come from?" "From my Uncle Howard's estate. He recovered it during his service in World War II. "And where is it now?" "In secure storage, being catalogued and authenticated. We're working with international organizations to arrange returns to families." Pritchett's jaw tightened. "Mr. Hayes, if you're hiding assets that should be in government custody—" "We're not hiding anything," Margaret interrupted. She'd found her courage somewhere in the last 4 months. "We're doing what your government failed to do for 70 years. We're giving these pieces back to the people they were stolen from. That's not your decision to make." "Actually," Isaac said, appearing behind Thomas and Margaret, "it is. I'm the Trust's legal counsel. Everything we're doing is completely lawful. We've notified all appropriate authorities. We're cooperating with international restitution organizations. We're following every protocol. If you have specific concerns, I'm happy to address them through proper legal channels." Pritchett glared at Isaac. "This isn't over." "I didn't think it would be," Isaac replied calmly. After they left, Thomas sat down heavily in his kitchen chair. "Are we going to survive this?" "I don't know," Isaac said honestly. "But you're doing the right thing. That has to count for something." By May, the story had leaked. A journalist from the Washington Post got wind of what was happening. She contacted Ruth, who consulted with Thomas and Margaret. They made a decision together: go public, tell the story before someone else told it wrong. The article ran on a Sunday. Front page. Elderly couple inherits $245 million Holocaust art collection, chooses restitution over profit. The story went viral within hours. By Monday morning, Thomas and Margaret's phone was ringing constantly. News trucks appeared in Pine Ridge. Reporters knocked on their door. Their neighbors, who'd thought they'd inherited nothing, suddenly realized they'd been living next to one of the biggest art discoveries of the century. Janet Pritchard from the beauty salon called. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" "Because it wasn't about us," Margaret said simply. The media attention was overwhelming. Thomas and Margaret did one interview with the Washington Post journalist who'd broken the story. They sat in their small living room surrounded by worn furniture and faded wallpaper and told the truth. "We're not heroes," Thomas said. "My Uncle Howard was the hero. He gave up everything to protect these pieces. We're just trying to finish what he started." "But you could have sold the collection," the journalist pressed, "made hundreds of millions of dollars, lived comfortably for the rest of your lives." Margaret shook her head. "That's not what Howard wanted, and it's not what the pieces deserve. They belong to the families they were stolen from. We're just the custodians. Do you regret it? Inheriting this responsibility?" Thomas and Margaret looked at each other. 4 months ago, they'd been two broke elderly people worried about paying their electric bill. Now they were at the center of an international story about art, justice, and memory. Their lives had been turned completely upside down. "No," Margaret said finally. "I don't regret it. For the first time in years, maybe ever, I feel like what we're doing matters. Like we're part of something bigger than ourselves." The interview was published with photographs. Thomas and Margaret in their small house. The exterior of the bunker, though they didn't show the entrance to the chamber. Copies of Howard's journals, and most powerfully, photographs of the pieces being returned to families. The response was immediate and massive. Donations poured into the Hayes Restitution Trust. People from around the world sent money to support the work. Survivors and their descendants contacted Ruth with information about stolen pieces. Museums offered to help with authentication. Universities offered research support, but there was also backlash. Some government officials claimed Thomas and Margaret were interfering with official investigations. Some argued the collection should be turned over to museums, not private families. Auction houses complained about the loss of potential sales. Collectors grumbled about the precedent being set. And then there were the threats. Real ones this time. Not anonymous notes, but explicit warnings. People who wanted the collection for themselves. People who believed it should be sold and the money used for other purposes. People who thought Thomas and Margaret were naive fools being manipulated. In June, someone broke into the bunker. They didn't find the chamber. Howard's security had been too good for that, but they vandalized the upper structure, smashed the windows, destroyed Howard's books, spray-painted threats on the walls. Thomas found it when he drove up for his weekly check. He stood in the doorway and felt something break inside him. "They want to scare us," he said to Margaret when he got home. "They want us to give up." "Are you scared?" she asked. "Terrified. Me too." She took his hand. "But we're not giving up." They hired security, round-the-clock protection for the bunker, cameras, motion sensors, guards. It cost money they didn't personally have, but the foundation covered it, Ruth insisted. The collection was too important to leave unprotected. In July, they had a breakthrough. One of the pieces, a painting by Klimt, had been stolen from a family in Vienna in 1938. The family had been decimated, parents killed, children scattered. For decades, everyone assumed the entire line had died. But Dr. Feldman, the authentication expert, found a lead. A daughter had survived. She'd been hidden by a Christian family, raised under a false name, eventually emigrated to Australia. Her name was Eva Zimmerman. She was 94 years old, living in a nursing home in Melbourne. When Ruth called her, Eva couldn't believe it. "The Klimt?" Her voice was thin, ancient, but sharp with memory. "The woman in gold?" "Yes," Ruth said. "We've found it." Eva was silent for so long they thought the connection had dropped. Then they heard crying, soft, broken sobbing of someone who'd carried grief for 90 years. "My mother loved that painting," Eva finally managed. "She used to sit in front of it every morning with her coffee. She said it reminded her that beauty exists even when the world is cruel." They arranged for the painting to be flown to Australia. Eva was too frail to travel, so they brought the painting to her. Margaret and Thomas went too, the first time either of them had left the country. The foundation paid for the flights. The nursing home was bright and clean, overlooking the ocean. Eva sat in a wheelchair by the window, wrapped in blankets despite the Australian winter being mild. When they wheeled in the painting, still covered, she reached out with trembling hands. They unveiled it slowly. The woman in gold emerged, her face serene, her dress shimmering with real gold leaf that caught the light. Eva gasped, touched the frame, pressed her fingers to the glass protecting the canvas. "Oh," she whispered. "Oh, Mama!" she cried. They all cried. The nursing home staff cried. Even the security guard standing by the door wiped his eyes. Eva told them stories about her mother, her father, her little brother who died when he was 6. She told them about the last morning before they were taken, how her mother had stood in front of this painting one final time. "She knew," Eva said. "She knew she'd never see it again. But she smiled at me and said, 'Beauty survives, Eva, even when we don't.'" They left the painting with her. It hung in her room for the last 3 months of her life. When she died in October, peaceful in her sleep, her will stated that the painting should be donated to the Jewish Museum in Melbourne, along with her mother's story. News of Eva's reunion with the Klimt spread globally. It became the face of what the Hayes Restitution Trust was doing. Photographs of the 94-year-old woman touching the painting her mother had loved appeared in newspapers around the world. The story resonated in a way facts and figures never could. Donations to the trust tripled. Volunteers offered to help with research. Governments that had been resistant started cooperating. Even David Pritchett backed off, though Margaret suspected he still watched them closely. By the end of the year, they'd returned 43 pieces to families. Each return was documented, celebrated, mourned. Because every piece came with stories of loss. Every reunification was also a reminder of who was gone. Thomas and Margaret aged visibly during those months. The stress, the travel, the emotional weight of it all took its toll. Thomas's back got worse. Margaret developed high blood pressure, but they refused to slow down. "We won't live forever," Thomas said one night. They were in bed, exhausted, listening to December wind rattle the windows. "But we can do as much as possible while we're here." "Do you think Howard would be proud?" Margaret asked. Thomas thought about that. "I think he'd be relieved that someone finally cared enough to finish it." In January, 1 year after they'd first visited the bunker, they held a ceremony. Not a big public event, but something small and meaningful. They gathered at the bunker with Ruth, Isaac, Dr. Feldman, and a dozen descendants of families who'd received pieces back. Someone said Kaddish, the Jewish prayer for the dead. They said it for Howard, for all the people who'd died in the camps, for everyone who'd lost something beautiful to hatred. Afterward, they unveiled a plaque on the exterior of the bunker. It read, "The Howard Hayes Memorial Chamber, in honor of one man's 40-year mission to return beauty to the world. May we all have such courage." As they stood in the snow, Margaret thought about the past year, about how completely their lives had changed. They weren't rich, not personally. All the money went to the foundation. They still lived in their rental house, still worried about bills, still struggled with the same things they'd always struggled with. But something fundamental had shifted. They had purpose now. They had meaning. They were part of something that would outlast them. "You know what's strange?" Margaret said to Thomas that night. "A year ago, we thought we were broke, Thought we had nothing. Turns out we had everything. We just didn't know it yet. By spring, they'd returned 98 pieces, more than half the collection. Each return took time, research, authentication, legal work. But Ruth and her team had built a system. They'd trained volunteers. They'd established partnerships with organizations around the world. The Hayes Restitution Trust had become a model for how to do this work right. Transparent, ethical, focused on justice rather than profit. Other families who'd inherited questionable art started contacting them for advice. Museums reached out to discuss pieces in their collections with murky provenance. Thomas and Margaret became unlikely celebrities in the restitution world. They were invited to speak at conferences, though they rarely accepted. They preferred to work quietly, letting Ruth and the others handle the public-facing aspects. But occasionally they agreed, usually when survivors or their descendants specifically asked to meet them. One such event was in Washington, D.C. at the Holocaust Memorial Museum. They were invited to speak about Howard's work and the ongoing mission of the trust. Thomas was terrified, Margaret less so, though she spent 3 days writing and rewriting her remarks. The auditorium was packed. Maybe 500 people, including several members of Congress, museum directors, diplomats. Margaret stood at the podium and looked out at all those faces waiting for her to say something profound. "I'm not a speechwriter," she began, her voice shaking slightly. "I'm a librarian, was a librarian. I shelved books 10 hours a week for minimum wage. My husband was a construction worker until his back gave out. We're nobody special." She paused. Someone in the front row nodded encouragingly. "But a year ago, we inherited a responsibility from a man we barely knew. My husband's uncle, Howard Hayes, had spent 40 years protecting art that didn't belong to him, protecting it for people he'd never meet, people who might not even be alive anymore. He gave up comfort, companionship, a normal life. He lived alone in a bunker because he believed that some things are worth protecting even when nobody's watching." Her voice got stronger. "Everyone keeps asking us why we didn't just sell the collection, why we didn't keep the money. And honestly, we thought about it. We're not saints. We're just two old people who can barely pay our bills. But then we read Howard's journals. We saw the letters from survivors. We understood that this wasn't about money. It was about memory. It was about saying that what happened to these people, the theft of their lives and their culture and their beauty, it mattered. It still matters." She looked at Thomas, who sat in the front row. He was crying quietly, not from sadness, but from pride. "We're not going to live long enough to return every piece," Margaret continued. "The work will continue after we're gone, but if we can give even one family back something they thought was lost forever, if we can honor Howard's sacrifice by finishing what he started, then maybe our lives meant something too. Maybe that's enough." The applause was thunderous, a standing ovation that went on for several minutes. Margaret stood at the podium, overwhelmed, until Thomas came up and took her hand. They stood together, two elderly people who'd stumbled into history and chosen to stay. That summer, their daughter Jennifer came to visit with her family. She'd been following the news, reading the articles, watching from a distance. Now she wanted to understand. They took her up to the bunker, showed her the chamber, though it was mostly empty now. Most of the pieces had been returned or moved to secure museum storage, pending authentication and legal work. But a few remained, pieces that were still being researched or that had no clear provenance yet. Jennifer walked through the stone chamber, her footsteps echoing. She looked at the empty shelves, the climate control units still humming, the desk where Howard had kept his meticulous records. "This is what you gave up wealth for?" she finally asked. "We didn't give up anything," Margaret said. "We gained everything." Jennifer looked at her mother. "You could have been rich. You could have helped me and my siblings. Could have had security." "We have security," Thomas said quietly. just not the kind that shows up in a bank account. Jennifer was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I'm proud of you, both of you. I didn't understand at first. I thought maybe you'd made a mistake, been taken advantage of, but I see it now. This matters more than money." That night, they all had dinner together at the small rental house. Jennifer's kids asked a million questions about the art and the families and Howard. They wanted to know everything. Thomas and Margaret answered patiently, telling stories until the kids' eyes grew heavy with sleep. After everyone had gone to bed, Margaret sat on the porch with Jennifer. The night was warm, full of cricket song and distant thunder. "Are you happy?" Jennifer asked. Margaret considered the question. "I'm tired. I'm scared sometimes. I worry about what happens when we're too old to continue this work. But yeah, I'm happy. Happier than I've been in years." "Because of the art?" "Because of the purpose," Margaret corrected. "Your father and we spent so long just surviving, working, paying bills, getting by. We thought that was all life was. But this past year we've been living, actually living. It's exhausting and terrifying and incredible all at once." Jennifer hugged her mother tight. "I wish Grandpa Howard could see this, could see what you've done." "Maybe he can," Margaret said softly. By the end of the second year, they'd returned or documented homes for 162 pieces. 83 remained, most of them with complicated or impossible provenance. Owners dead with no heirs, countries that no longer existed, disputes between claimants that might take decades to resolve. The trust continued its work. Ruth and Isaac handled most of the day-to-day operations now. Thomas and Margaret had stepped back slightly, their health requiring it. Thomas had had a minor heart attack in the fall. Margaret's blood pressure medication had been adjusted 3 times. They were slowing down, and they knew it. One cold afternoon in December, 2 years and 1 month after they'd first opened the chamber, they sat in the bunker together, alone. No researchers, no volunteers, no security. Just them and the empty shelves and the ghosts of beauty that had passed through. "We did it," Thomas said. "We finished what Howard started." "Not finished," Margaret corrected. "Continued. There's more work to do. There will always be more work. But we did our part." "Yeah," she agreed, "we did." Thomas reached into his pocket and pulled out something small. The first brass key, the one Red Callahan had given them that cold January day 2 years ago. It was worn smooth now, warm from being carried. "What happens to this place when we're gone?" he asked. "The trust will maintain it," Margaret said. "Keep it as Howard kept it, a reminder." "A reminder of what?" She thought about that. That one person can make a difference, that caring matters even when it's hard, that beauty deserves protection, that memory is sacred. They sat in comfortable silence as the winter light faded outside. 2 years ago, they'd been strangers to this place, to this mission, to this purpose. Now it was as much a part of them as their own heartbeat. In the years that followed, though they slowed, they never stopped completely. Thomas and Margaret became the keepers of Howard's story. They spoke when asked, always emphasizing that they were simply continuing a dead man's mission. They helped train the next generation of restitution workers. They answered questions from families searching for lost pieces. The trust grew beyond them. It employed researchers, authenticators, legal experts. It partnered with institutions around the world. It became what Howard had dreamed of, but never lived to see. A permanent organization dedicated to healing some small wounds of history. Thomas died in his sleep at 79, 5 years after they'd first visited the bunker. He went peacefully, Margaret beside him, their hands clasped. His last words were, "We finished it. We kept faith." Margaret lived 3 more years. She spent them writing down everything she and Thomas had learned, every story, every lesson. She created a guidebook for the trust, practical advice from someone who'd lived through it. Her last entry, written 2 days before a stroke took her, said simply, "Art reminds us we're human. Protecting it is how we stay human. Never forget that." They were buried in Pine Ridge, in the small cemetery on the hill overlooking the town. Their headstone was simple, just their names and dates, but beside it, the trust placed a second stone. It read, "Thomas and Margaret Hayes. They inherited a secret and chose justice. May their memory be a blessing." The Hayes Restitution Trust continues today. It has returned over 200 pieces from Howard's original collection. It has helped dozens of other families navigate the complex world of art restitution. It has become a model for ethical, compassionate work in a field often dominated by greed and politics. And every year, on the anniversary of Thomas and Margaret's first visit to the bunker, the Trust holds a ceremony. Descendants of families who've received pieces back gather. Volunteers who've worked on the mission come. People who never knew Thomas or Margaret or Howard but who've been touched by their story show up. They stand in the snow or the rain or the sunshine, depending on the weather. Someone reads from Howard's journals, someone else from Margaret's guidebook. They remember, because that's what it was always about. Not the money, not the art, though the art mattered. It was about remembering, about refusing to let cruelty erase beauty, about believing that justice delayed can still be justice delivered, about two elderly people who inherited a frozen shelter nobody wanted and found underneath it not just treasure, but purpose. In the end, Thomas and Margaret Hayes weren't remembered for being rich. They were remembered for being decent, for choosing to honor a dead man's mission over personal gain, for understanding that some inheritances come with obligations that matter more than price tags. They inherited $245 million worth of art and gave it all away, and in doing so, they became wealthier than they'd ever dreamed possible. Because sometimes the most valuable things in life can't be deposited in a bank. Sometimes the greatest wealth is knowing you've done something that matters, that you've kept faith, that you've chosen memory over money, justice over comfort, purpose over ease. Anyone can stumble into an inheritance, but it takes real courage to recognize that some gifts come with responsibilities bigger than yourself. It takes wisdom to understand that protecting someone else's legacy might be the greatest thing you ever build. Thomas and Margaret Hayes understood that. They lived it. And in the end, they proved that it doesn't matter if you're old or broke or forgotten by the world. If you have the courage to do what's right when nobody's watching, you can change everything. The snowed-in shelter they inherited for 75 cents became a monument, not to wealth, but to what matters more than wealth, not to fame, but to quiet, determined faithfulness. And somewhere in the mountains of West Virginia, in a chamber carved from stone, protected by lead and love and the ghosts of those who believed beauty could survive evil, the last few pieces of Howard Hayes's collection still wait. Wait for the day when the research is complete, when the families are found, when justice can finally come home. Because some work takes generations, some missions outlast the people who start them. But as long as someone remembers, as long as someone cares, the work continues. And that, more than any treasure hidden in the dark, is the real inheritance Thomas and Margaret Hayes left behind. The end. Up next, 2 more powerful stories are waiting for you. Click to keep discovering truth with us. And don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe legacy isn't about what you keep, but what you give away.